Very happy to welcome Professor Norman Saul at the second Brownbag lecture of this semester. Welcome back. Professor Saul will present a paper titled A Ghost Paper from the Past, the Helsingfors Sailors' Assembly in 1917. But before we proceed, I just would like to say that, of course, we're continuing with the Brownbag lectures, and in February we have 3 left. Next week, Randy Maston will speak about Somalia between the USSR and the West, 1960-91. Our CREASE master student, Liam Burnside, will deliver a paper on February 20th, and this is called Being Tajik, Beyond Ethnicity. And then on February 27th, Professor Maria Amelicheva will talk about human trafficking in Central Asia. So this is our offering for the month of February. Also next week, we will have our first screening of the Kino movie nights. So on Thursday, February 15th at 7 p.m. in this room, Marta Pirnat-Greenberg will present a recent Croatian movie titled The Constitution. She will introduce the movie, and in case you're curious what it's about, the story follows 4 people who live in the same building but avoid each other because of the differences in their assets, sexual habits, nationality, and religion. So this is our plan for next week and for February. And let me welcome you again to CREASE. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, and thank you for coming today. A rather wintry day. First of all, can anyone take 2 tickets to tonight's basketball game? I'm not going. There you go. They're pretty good seats.
Awesome. Make one teenager very
We're
happy.
not up to it. We went to Saturday's game.
Thank you so much.
They're good seats, too. We share season tickets with another friends, faculty members for about 20 years now, but they didn't want to take them either, so for tonight. I'd like to talk a little bit about the different subject. We just got back from Cuba on a trip there, a tour, and I'm still digesting my impressions. Strange country, third world in many respects, first world in others, education level, medicine level, etc. But anyway, it's state socialism without corruption. At least I didn't see any. But with quirks. Quirks. Cows belong to the state. Horses are private, like cars, pigs, chickens, and goats, all private. But cows, there's not much beef in Cuba because cows belong to the state. You can have them and milk them, but proceeds go to the state, most of it anyway. There's a strange mathematics, as we learned going to a tobacco farm out west of Havana. We had a lot of tours. The tour group was alumni associations. I was with Columbia Alumni, and North Carolina was probably the biggest other alumni association. So we divided up in 2 buses, Columbia and North Carolina. But there were a few others, like Georgetown, that came in with the groups. And so that's the way you go to Cuba, is with a tour group. You can't go just individually. And this tour group emphasized people to people. And so every day you had some interaction with a Cuban group. And that proved to be more interesting than I expected. I didn't know what to expect, in fact, with these interactions. but they seemed to work out since several of them were musical, and Cubans are great at music, and I've at least learned that, and came away with several CDs, in fact, to add to my collection. Our introduction, while we stayed at a pretty luxurious hotel. All hotels in Cuba are state-owned and managed. There are some B&Bs that are private. We didn't get into any of that. But 3 nights we spent at the Emilia Havana Hotel, which is a newish hotel in the outskirts of Havana. But the first day, on the schedule, showed up about 20 ancient American cars in fine condition at the hotel for a tour of downtown Havana, which was really nice. We rode in a 1940 Chevy convertible. I mean, has anyone seen something like that around here? I haven't. Beautiful condition with leather seats and everything. So that was, and old cars, or American cars, are prevalent all over Cuba, not just in Havana, but you see them on the roads there also. And many ladas, if anyone is familiar with the lada, lots of ladas in pretty poor condition for the most part, but still surviving in Cuba. With a vestige of the Soviet presence, which is resented all along, everywhere. Especially the other thing that's a remnant of the Soviet presence in Cuba are the Khrushchev, the Khrushchev apartment buildings, 5-story, outskirts of cities, and mostly in a derelict condition, and mostly uninhabited, derelict. But anyway, that's there. I hadn't realized how much the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba in 1991, suddenly everybody was out, and all trade agreements and everything else was gone. And Cuba entered into what Fidel Castro called a special period. That's the way he called it. And Cuba went into all right austerity, going back to a century, basically. Mass breeding of horses for horse carts. You saw horse carts everywhere. It was the main feature on the highways, was horse carts. It's the main method of transportation for Cuba. A surprise to me. We were in 2 luxurious Japanese buses for our trip. And they jockeyed around these horse carts constantly on the highways. There were one stretch of, you might say, superhighway, I guess, outside of Havana toward Santa Clara and to Centaviegas, and where we met the ship. The ship was in Santiago. Havana and Santa Clara are on the north shore, the Atlantic shore of Cuba, and Centaviegas and Santiago de Cuba, which is one of my favorite places, are on the Caribbean side of Cuba, the South Shore. Anyway, the superhighway was something that resembled I've seen in Russia, where you get about 4 or 5 lanes. It tends to shift as you go along, from 5 to 6 lanes, and nobody observes the lanes. So you wander around as you go, searching for the most level part of the road. and it's pretty much rough going on the roads everywhere. But many of the roads were really very narrow, 2-lane roads, like going to the tobacco farm, and other places that we went. So there's a lot to be done there in infrastructure in Cuba for road conditions. And the variety of transportation is immense. From these horse cars I described, some of them can hold about 6 people and are like little buses. And then there are trucks with people standing in the converted trucks to buses to haul people from place to place. And then lots of hitchhiking. People just standing along the road, hitchhiking in perhaps one of those old American cars. When we were married, my wife and I, back in 1959, she had a 1953 Chevy. And we got to New York in it, barely, that summer, and then ran into parking situations, and ended up selling it for, I think, $200, something like that. And I asked where it was going. They said, south. Cuba or Puerto Rico, I don't know where, but it may still be running down there when Cuba was given that what we saw.
I've seen them in these old Chevys.
Yeah, but it's a horse cart transportation system. But one of our first outings out of Havana was to a tobacco farm on the western end of Cuba, where most of the tobacco is farmed. Mainly, there's just 2 crops in Cuba for export purpose or interest. Tobacco is the main one, is one of them. Sugar cane is the other. Most of the sugar cane doesn't go into sugar anymore since they don't have any market for it. And in fact, Cuba actually imports sugar these days, but most of it goes to rum, making rum, and that's a major export. So that brings in money. We didn't take out any rum. In fact, none of our group did, because the Cuban rum bottles are rather thin, and they go. If you export them, bring them into America, they have to go into checked luggage. And that's, don't do it, is what we were told. So anyway, but we had quite a bit of rum everywhere. Everything gets topped off with rum, whether it's coffee or some other drink that's provided. Like if you go to a tobacco farm, you're going to be served something. And this was white coffee. And white coffee is coffee topped off with white rum. So it's simple. Anyway, tobacco farm, that came from the farm, hand rolled by the tobacco farmer himself. 10 cigars, $10, probably pretty cheap, and not first quality certainly. But he had to provide 90% of his crop, and they were harvesting the tobacco when we were there, and we sat in the tobacco shed, a barn actually, with the grass roofs, and he rolled out a cigar in 2 minutes. He did it, expert. He had it just right off the leaves and hanging there. And here's another. Cuba, baseball is the major sport. Has been. There are 15 provinces, and each province has a team. They were having playoffs when we were there. Some people wanted to go to a game, but they were not in the provinces we were going through. the tobacco farmer, and I was very impressed by him and his family. These stops couple as rest stops. That is, they have facilities in the house for us to visit, and they're prepared for that, as well as providing. I'm sure they got paid well by the tour company and so forth for this visit. 90% of his crop had to go to the state and to state cigar factories, which some of them are hand-rolled. I think for a hand-rolled state cigar, probably $20 at minimum. Others go for $5, $10 each, machine-rolled. But that's a major crop there. And you don't see any cigarettes. It's all cigars. 90% goes to the state. He keeps 20%. They call that Cuban math. That goes everywhere. If you're giving 80% to the state, you keep 30%. There's flexibility, obviously, in this arrangement. Well, anyway, he had 20% that he rolled out and sold on his own from his crop. The land was state-owned, so the state takes the big share of that. But he has his own house, which is his, on the farm, on this little farm, and collected what he could from the farm, and grows some other things. Everywhere we went into the countryside, there were lots of evidence of homegrown produce. Everybody had a banana tree. It seemed like. They were little tiny bananas, but they were there. And they had other things, guavas. There was always a guava tree. There was always something like that. There were always pigs and chickens, which belonged to them, that they could use, and obviously did. We saw on one little farm big pots of chicken being cooked for the family meal. Not for us, but for the family meal. And pork was also evident, but I think most of the eating we did at state restaurants or parcador, that I may not have the name correct, but these are private restaurants. They'd have to turn over a big percent to the state, but they operate and they earn profits on the, and we ate at a number of those at lunchtime, out away from the ship or the hotel. We visited Ernest Hemingway's house in Havana, suburb. Bit of a disappointment because it was not open. It's closed permanently. And you could look in the windows, and I could look in and see his bathroom with a bookshelf beside the toilet. Interesting, I guess. But Hemingway is a star in Havana, much praised and revered as an American idol, icon, you might say. But I couldn't find a Hemingway T-shirt in all of Havana, in all of Cuba. Didn't exist. I found one of those magnets that goes on a refrigerator with Hemingway Cuba. That was the closest I could get. Che Guevara has the monopoly on T-shirts. Not Fidel Castro, which is what I might have thought, but Castros are evident, pictures now and then, but the big presence is Che Guevara for some reason, who of course is not Cuban, but is a Cuban hero. Anyway. We were on this French sailing ship for 6 days, mostly in Santiago de Cuba harbor, where it was anchored in this harbor, and you had to take what they called zodiacs, rubber lifeboat, into shore. And we did that back and forth for several days to get our bus and go off in the countryside somewhere. Or in one case, charge up San Juan Hill in our Japanese bus. But San Juan Hill is very carefully preserved as a monument. They respect America for having delivered freedom to Cuba out of the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt and all that. The Rough Riders went up the hill. But the interesting thing about the monument was the commemoration, especially of the black contingents, the Buffalo Soldiers, who suffered most of the losses on taking San Juan Hill during that time. The Cuban population, I would judge, as 50%, probably at least 50% mulatto, and the rest divided between white and black. So it's a mixed race island, and does apparently very well with, racism is outlawed completely, and you didn't see any sign of it anywhere. You saw the mixes constantly at various places, especially in the music world. Maybe I did mention that we sailed for 36 hours on this ship, and about half the time, through 2 nights, we were under sail, which was an experience to be. You could tell when you're under sail because the ship was slanted constantly, and also balanced by the sails. But about half the time we were not under sail, it was pretty rough. And that was why we were not under sail. It was rough seas. So anyway, one of the other interesting things was, in our visits, was the Santa Diego Down Syndrome Activity Center. We were given a presentation by Down syndrome individuals in music presentation and so forth, and it was very interesting. And they were earning their money for the center by their own artwork and shows that they put on in various towns and earned money for. And that was interesting. There were adults, of course, directing that. There was also another senior center in Santa Clara that was interesting, but particularly the emphasis on universal medical care. That's free. That's part of socialism. And all education is free from the beginning. They provide uniforms, and the uniforms are present for the elementary and secondary school, not for university, but universities are free. And university attendance is as high as in America. It's very up there. And the medical training is particularly emphasized, with Cuban doctors going all over the Latin world, I guess, South America and Central America. And they earn money, and that's hard money, hard currency, convertible at least, but they have to turn half of it over to the state when they come back to Cuba. They're away for 2 years, 2-year term of service. And military service is also required. Everyone does it. Again, it's 1 year if you're going to a university, 2 years if you're not. Incentive, I guess, to go to a university. We had 2 Cuban guides who were wonderful, in their 30s, excellent English, and full of the Cuban vitality, I guess you could say. and 2 American, Spanish-speaking American guides that were part of the tour organization. And anyway, we heard a lot of it. The tour group, actually we were hard pressed, busy every time. Breakfast at 7, on the bus at 8, you know, that sort of thing. You got kept busy constantly, it seemed. And we're still kind of recovering from that. That's why these basketball tickets are available. Anyway, I better turn to my other topic. Oh, I got half an hour. Helsingfors Sailors Assembly and the ghost paper. Last summer, I was sorting through some stuff, trying to get rid of things, thin things out, and ran across a paper I had forgotten about that I had done back a long time ago, at least 40 years ago. When I was working on a book, Sailors in Revolt, the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1917. I've tabbed a few things of pictures and maps. I did these own maps. The only time, my one and only adventure into map making in this book. This was my master's thesis at Columbia. It was 1969, 1967, and everyone in the seminar had to do something on the Russian Revolution. It was the 50th anniversary, and so I decided to do something. My inclination toward naval topics goes back to World War II, when I had a cousin who lived across the back fence of our farm who went into the Navy. He had graduated from Annapolis in 1941, assigned to Pearl Harbor, survived, but then continued to serve in the Navy in the Pacific throughout World War II. And I was intrigued by that whole idea of this older cousin being in the Navy throughout that war. And I had 2 uncles also serving in the Army, one in the Pacific, a private in the Army. And all that kind of got to me, I guess. And other things that led into that, like being addicted to the Hornblower series of C.S. Forester as a kid, young man. Anyway, I did the Baltic Fleet in World War I and the Revolution as my master's thesis. And I thought, well, I've done everything. I've looked at all the printed stuff. Archives were not available in Russia or anywhere else. And so I went to something else for my doctoral dissertation, totally different. Russia and the Mediterranean, 1797 to 1807. I didn't bring in a copy, but I think there's a couple around here. And then I decided to go on to a sequel to that. It was going to be called Russia and the Baltic, 1807 to 1815, the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, when Russian interests shifted north from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, and fought a little war with Sweden, acquired Finland. Finland became part of Russia, and along with Finland, a lot of merchant marine activity became Russian. So I applied for a Fulbright Grant to Finland to do this topic. And I did part of it. I did some of it. Went into some of the archives in Finland and in Sweden. I spent a week in Stockholm, in the Stockholm archives, working on port records and things like that for that period. But it wasn't really turning out very well. And in the meantime, I had discovered other material on the Baltic Fleet in World War I and the Revolution. And I decided, well, I'll go back to that. And so that's where this book comes from, additional research that I did in Finland during that year. So I switched topics. The first one that I went there to do didn't get done, but I did finish off this other one to make it useful, I guess, endeavor. What got me into the Baltic Fleet materials was going to the Finnish War Archive. Not many people have used it. In fact, I don't know of anyone else that has. And there was nobody else there when I was working in the Finnish War Archive. I had to be interviewed by a Finnish colonel in military intelligence to get into the archive. And then when I got into it, there's a Russian collection. It's about 5,000 boxes, and the boxes are wooden boxes that compose this collection. And it dates from the 18th century on up, and it was the 18th century part of it, or the early 19th century part of it, that got me into the beginning of it. But then I ran across other stuff. And it is an intriguing collection. I mean, lots of stuff that one finds only modestly interesting, like the manuals of how to run the motors on a torpedo boat. What can you do with that? Well, I actually found it interesting leafing through. And the trajectory charts of the artillery of a battleship, big things laid out, fancy stuff. I don't know what one could do with that, but I didn't. But in the process, I ran across the protocols of the Helsingfors Sailors Assembly. Now, they were still using the Swedish language in 1917 of names of Helsingfors rather than Helsinki, Sveaborg rather than Suomenlinna, the fortress that is the base of most of the fleet in 1917. Now, I also already knew that Finland was something of an exception or case of administration of the Russian Empire. Finland had its own administration, at least after 1905, and through 1917. The banking system was separate from the ruble. The Finnmark was the currency of Finland. Army recruitment did not apply to Finland. There was no draft to the army. No Finns served in the Russian army during World War I. Well, officers did. There was the officer class, the nobility, were already there and traditionally served, as the Baltic Germans did, as officers in the Army and Navy, and particularly the Finns in the Navy. So it's like a neutral country. And here you have the largest fleet of the Russian Empire based in a neutral country. So that's something strange. There are about 60,000 Russians in Helsingfors, and the Finnish capital. That's about a little over a third of the population at the time. So that's a good portion of the population. The fleet, well, there were several problems. First of all, the fleet had considerable conflict uprising in February. The February Revolution was devastating to the command control of the Baltic Fleet. The commander of the fleet, Neponin, Admiral Neponin, was shot in the back and killed at the beginning of the demonstrations. The commander of the battleship squadron also killed. 2-3 other high-ranking officers. Even worse in Kronstadt, which is the training center of the Baltic Fleet, when the port commander was literally torn apart on the street in Kronstadt. What made things worse there was the release of the inmates from the disciplinary barracks of the Baltic Fleet who had grievances. Anyway, the revolution took place in February. Nothing happened in October. In fact, there's a little book in Russian that says about the fleet, memoir of the fleet. October and February was the title of it. Nothing happens in October. It's all done. It's fully supporting the Bolshevik Soviet apparatus. One reason for that is the skill by which organizations like the Sailors' Assembly come into being. The Sailors' Assembly represents the fleet in Helsingfors. This is with the battleships, cruisers, 500 ships, 40,000 sailors, and so on. Now, the February Revolution also, and even prior to that, the fleet is immobilized in Helsingfors. It can't move because of ice for a good part of the year and because of minefields the rest of the year. Now, many of these minefields are Russian minefields that were laid to prevent the German approach and successfully did that. But it also successfully moored the Russian ships in place. Now, they had maps for the minefields, but after a winter or two of freezing and thawing, they're not any good anymore. The mines have drifted all over the place. So there's no traffic out in the Baltic, in the Gulf of Finland during this period. So many of the officers now reside in apartments on shore. They're not going to be on those ships that are hot in summer and cold in the winter. But the sailors are there and left alone pretty much. But they are still organized. They still have respect for the ships themselves. They have a loyalty to the ships and want to keep them in being in case of that can be used. A few of them are used in 1917, but that was kind of a rare exception. The most famous ship of the Baltic Fleet was probably the cruiser Aurora, which was at Kronstadt when it was out at sea in 1916, barely able to get back because it run into a mine, to Petrograd for rehabilitation, restoring. It was in repair works at the Franco-Russian shipbuilding plant at the mouth of the Neva. And so I'm not going to get into that, but you've heard the story, the cruiser Aurora and the Russian Revolution. But the other things are happening in Helsingfors. And there's this assembly, which I found in this archive, the Finnish archive, 92 protocols. Now, the protocols are kind of a joint of a agenda and minutes. It's an agenda with people, things added on what they did with the items on the agenda, with other agenda items thrown in. Kind of a mess. The first 3 protocols were missing, not there. But I found out from the protocol number 4, what did we accomplish during the first 3? We acquired a typewriter. So that made possible the print, the typing and producing by mimeograph protocols. Very neatly done and very good Russian. Get a sense that there was a real sense of organization. Now, there was a list also in the archive that I found of the complex of the assembly. 292 names, 180 deputies, stand-ins for the. That's a pretty large body. Now, in the protocols, they usually gave the number of votes in favor, but not in opposition. So you don't know the total number of people attending, except in a few cases. And the average seemed to be around 150. There was a list of the membership. That's unusual. They have a list of the membership and who they were by name, everything, what unit they belonged to. Every battleship had six deputies representing them. Every vessel, including small ones, had at least one deputy. So that's how it was made up. The other thing was the age was listed for most of them. The average age was 27. In my earlier version of this article, I said, these are no panty raiders. They're serious, trained experts with service experience. They know what they're doing. That's what intrigued me especially was some of the sessions, they met 3 times a week throughout 1917, from March 4th to November 18th. That's the extent of the protocols, some 90, some of them. Most of them are there in that archive. And that's what I used to develop this paper on the Sailors' Assembly. Now, I will kind of cut this off some, but 3 things that they mainly dealt with. Food supply, that was a main criteria immediately. They had warehouses storing food for the fleet on shore. They were ransacked, prey, out of control in the February Revolution. They quickly, one of the first things the Sailors' Assembly did was establish control and a rationing system that made sure that only sailors of the fleet were getting food supply, and organizing a system of replenishing that food supply. Now that was not easy because Finland, and this affects Petrograd in 1917, had a bad crop year. And much of the food for Petrograd, even, and Helsinki, of course, came from Finland. But that was a very desperate situation, and the Finns are really upset about the situation because the Russians are drafting off a lot of important food supply that should be Finland's. Anyway, that was one thing. The other thing was discipline, and to coordinate with Finnish Helsinki City Police and with the Helsingfors Soviet, which represents Russians and Finns, but is a separate body, on control, organizing police control throughout the streets and keeping everything pretty much in order. And it seemed to be that way. There were, of course, evidence of drunkenness, and there's numbers of sailors that are in contention, listed in the protocols. But things seemed surprisingly stable in comparison to Petrograd, at least, where there were demonstrations in the streets almost every day, every weekend. Helsinki is under control, and the sailors are accomplishing that, it seemed to me. Another problem that they had, though, was that there were too many organizations to deal with, and they were constantly getting membership drafted off to other organizations, deputies being assigned to the First Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, or the Second Congress of Soviets. There was a surprising representation from Helsingfors, from the Sailors' Assembly, at the Second All-Russian Congress in Petrograd, which staged the revolution. Anyway, two other things I wanted to say about this experience in Helsinki, where I was there for a full year, 12 months. Learned some Finnish and got to know pretty much the Finnish world. One other thing, there was another archive that I liked to use. It was called the Labor Archive, and it was the old Finnish Social Democratic Party archive, which had been preserved and brought under state control. And when I first went into it, you had to climb steps up to the top of the top floor to get to the reading room. Then there was a private elevator that went down to the basement. And to get anything from the library, from that archive, you had to go into the elevator, go down to the basement, and rummage around. That was the way it worked. And one day I went down and found a bunch of Pravda, 1917. And I just grabbed a bundle of it. It was pretty much a mess down there. Brought it up to the desk in the reading room and was going over some of the sheets, just looking at it. Well, where else can you go to the original Pravda issues? And a older man came by and said, "Hey, I know, you're reading Lenin's newspaper." And I said, "Yes, I know, it's the Bolshevik newspaper." He said, "No, I mean the newspaper that Lenin read when he was in Helsinki." That sent shivers up the... And it's true that Lenin did use that library to read the press from Petrograd. That made me look more carefully at the blue lines on the paper. Anyway, that was full of surprises. The whole thing about this Sailors' Assembly came to the front when I had discovered it that summer, and then came back to it later on in the November ACES meeting, when it so happened that I was on as a commentator for one of the sessions on military affairs in Russia during the revolution, along with Olga Poroshnova, who I think you all know, who had been here just before that. Well, then it turned out that one of the paper presenters couldn't be there. So we had two papers and two commentators, which seems kind of ridiculous. And so I volunteered to give this paper at that session. And I did. With Olga Poroshnova gave an excellent commentary on the paper, I thought, at the meeting. And then John Steinberg, who was another presenter, was very intrigued by it. And so it's now scheduled for publication in the War and Revolution series that Steinberg and others are doing for this. So I'd still have to tidy it up a bit, add a few things more on the Finnish side to get it in there, but I think it is a unique kind of thing. I don't know of any other kind of collection of revolutionary material so intact and complete for 1917 as was there in that archive. Okay.